Annie Oakley was an international superstar in her day. Chief Sitting Bull was so impressed by her sharpshooting skills, he gave her the nickname Little Sure Shot. She was a star of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show and his highest paid performer, an American legend, and her life was surprisingly tragic.
Let's dig into this. Did you know her name really wasn't Annie Oakley? She was born on August 13th, 1860 in a log cabin in Darke County, Ohio, and named Phoebe Ann. Her parents, Jacob and Susan, had 9 children. Annie was the 5th of 7 that survived. There's confusion regarding her last name. Annie said it was Mosey, but her brother used the name Moses, and most biographies use this name. Annie helped trap animals and hunt to help supply food for the family from an extremely young age. She was such a good shot by the age of 7 or 8, the family was actually able to sell some of their game she shot. Annie's father died in 1866 and left the family destitute. He had been caught in a blizzard 2 years earlier and became an invalid from that time on. It was the first tragedy of Annie's life.
At 9 years old, her life changed dramatically. In March of 1870, she was sent to the Darke County Infirmary to work. Annie learned to sew and care for some of the residents who were orphans, the insane, sick, and the poor. Soon she found herself hired out to a family looking, supposedly, for a young girl to help care for their infant and help with some of the household chores. Annie was promised a small wage, which would help her family. Apparently, it was all a lie.
In her autobiography, Annie never called the couple by their names. She called them the he-wolf and she-wolf. She said she worked from 4 a.m. till the work was finished, often, presumably, late at night. She took care of their livestock and the garden, the household chores, and the children, and never got paid. One time she said she fell asleep darning socks. The she-wolf threw her outside barefoot and without warm clothing in freezing weather. Annie thought she would die.
She wrote that her mother had been trying to get her home, but the couple held her prisoner. Eventually she ran away and tried to make her way back home. She would later say a stranger brought her a train ticket when he heard her story. Back home, she finally went to school for the first time in her life. And who showed up one day? The he-wolf came to take Annie back. She said a local man protected her, ran the he-wolf off, and she was never bothered again. She went back to shooting and selling game, and her reputation as a superior marksman grew in the area. By the time she was 15, Annie was able to pay off the mortgage on her mother's farm.
She became so famous locally that when a sharpshooter named Frank Butler from the Bauman and Butler Traveling Shooting Act came to town, a shooting match was set up. Frank and Annie went head-to-head through 24 rounds. On the 25th, Butler missed. Annie didn't. And Butler was in love. Annie and Frank married. She said on August 23rd, 1876, when she was 16. But the only official marriage certificate ever found was from Ontario, Canada in 1882. Frank may have been going through a divorce when he met Annie, so they may have discovered later the earlier date wasn't exactly legal and had a second and legally official marriage in Canada. Whatever the actual date was, Frank continued to tour his sharpshooting act and Annie went with him. But she wasn't part of the show.
The story of Annie becoming a star goes something like this. One night, Frank's shooting partner was ill and couldn't make the show. Annie filled in, holding targets. Somehow, Frank kept missing, and the crowd was getting rowdy. They started yelling, "Let the little girl shoot." Annie was tiny, just about 5 feet tall, and 10 years younger than Frank. Well, Frank did let her shoot. Annie hit every target. The crowd went wild, and a star was born. Annie took the name Oakley. It's been said that it was her grandmother's name, or it was the name of the neighborhood in Ohio where she and Frank lived, or the name of the man that bought her that fateful train ticket to get home. Wherever it came from that day forward, it was hers. Frank was delighted to support Annie's career and was totally devoted to her.
Annie Oakley and Frank Butler joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show in 1885. Annie and Sitting Bull, who was also in the show, became so close he called her his adopted daughter. She was incredibly popular, and her tricks were amazing. Frank performed with her, holding targets and letting her shoot cigarettes and cigars out of his mouth. She shot holes through playing cards and could cut a card held with the edge toward her. She snuffed out burning candles. She shot dimes thrown into the air, corks out of bottles, and targets behind her using a mirror. And she could also shoot with either hand. She became so famous that when theaters gave out free tickets to shows, which had a hole punched into them so they could not be sold, and were known as Annie Oakley tickets.
In 1894, Annie was the star of Thomas Edison's 11th kinetoscope film, Little Sure Shot of the Wild West. It was 21 seconds long and allowed people who couldn't go to the Wild West show to see Annie in action. Annie and Frank went to the Paris Exposition of 1889 with the Buffalo Bill Show and performed for kings and queens of Europe, including Queen Victoria of England. Kaiser Wilhelm III of Germany asked Annie to shoot the ashes off a cigarette in his mouth. She did.
In October 1901, Annie and Frank were traveling by train with the Wild West show. Annie was asleep in a car at the rear of the train when around 3 a.m., approximately 65 miles outside of Charlotte, South Carolina, the train was in a head-on collision with another train traveling in the opposite direction. At least 5 cars went into a creek and many others were knocked into a field. It was reported that 110 horses died. Annie's car was towards the end of the train, but it was one of the ones dumped into the creek, and she had been tossed from her bed and severely injured. Frank rescued her from the car and carried her to a temporary hospital set up nearby. Newspapers reported she was killed.
Annie was paralyzed and ended up having 5 surgeries and spending weeks recovering in the hospital. Her hair reportedly turned white almost overnight after the accident, but she did recover eventually. The trauma of the train accident caused the Butlers to leave the Buffalo Bill show.
Then in 1903, newspapers reported that Annie was arrested in Chicago for stealing a man's pants. The story said she wanted to sell them to buy drugs. Newspapers across the U.S. started running the juicy story. It wasn't true. Annie and Frank were in New Jersey at the time, and Annie never used drugs. An investigation found that the actual woman arrested in Chicago was Maud Fontella. She had given the police Annie's name when arrested. Annie sued every newspaper that ran the false story and won 54 out of the 55 cases. Unfortunately, she spent more money fighting the papers than she ever received.
Annie and Frank did perform on a limited basis with other shows for a while, but retired in 1913. They lived in Cambridge, Maryland, and adopted an English pointer they named Dave. He was their constant companion. During World War I, Annie, Frank, and Dave would tour for the Red Cross and perform at charity functions. Annie would shoot an apple or orange off of Dave's head during the show, and he would sniff out money hidden in the crowd. Newspapers called him Red Cross Dave or Dave the Red Cross Dog. Rumors spread that Annie was making a comeback, but tragedy struck again when Dave was hit by a car and killed. Annie and Frank were heartbroken.
In 1922, Annie was in a car accident in Florida and her hip and ankle were broken. Frank, who was 10 years older than the 62-year-old Annie, was already in declining health. The couple moved back to Ohio to be near family, and on November 3rd, 1926, Annie died of anemia at age 66. When Frank was told she was gone, he suffered her loss so deeply he stopped eating. He died 18 days after Annie on November 21st. They are buried at Brock Cemetery outside Greenville, Ohio, in the area where their story began.
Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed this video.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.
And we'll see you on the next one.